The air in Fauquier County, Virginia, in the late summer of 1845, was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and coming rain. But on the isolated Utterback farm, another smell had taken root. It was a sweet, cloying odor, greasy and unsettling, that clung to the humid air and turned the stomachs of those who passed too close on the dusty road. For weeks, it had seeped from the cracks in the small log cabin, a silent, macabre announcement that something inside was terribly wrong. Neighbors had begun to talk, their whispers carried on the same breeze that carried the stench. They spoke of Elizabeth Utterback, the new widow whose husband, John, had supposedly vanished, headed west for gold and a new life. They spoke of her strange composure, her lack of grief. And they spoke of the constant fire she kept burning under a massive iron cauldron in her yard, a fire she tended with a grim, almost religious devotion. She claimed she was making soap, a large batch to last the winter. But the smell wasn't the clean, caustic scent of lye and ash. It was something else entirely, something forbidden, something deeply, profanely biological. The local constable, a man named Manville, had heard the rumors. He had dismissed them at first, country gossip being as common as summer flies. But John Utterback's brother had been persistent, his concern curdling into suspicion. And so, on a grim, overcast afternoon, Constable Manville rode his horse up the winding path to the Utterback cabin, the strange, sweet smell growing stronger with every step, a foul perfume heralding a discovery so horrifying it would be seared into the annals of Virginian crime forever. He was a man of the law, accustomed to the grim realities of rural life, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to find. The cabin door creaked open before the constable could even knock. Elizabeth Utterback stood in the doorway, a gaunt figure silhouetted against the dim interior. Her face, framed by a severe, dark bonnet, was pale and drawn, her eyes holding a look that was not quite fear, but something harder, more defiant. She offered a curt greeting, her voice steady, betraying no alarm at the unexpected arrival of the law. Manville, a man whose instincts had been honed by years of dealing with liars and thieves, felt an immediate chill. Her calmness was unnatural. He inquired about her husband, John. Elizabeth repeated the story she had told everyone. He had packed a bag one night and left. Gone to seek his fortune in the territories, she said, a place where a man could start anew. She expressed a quiet, practiced sorrow, the kind one learns to perform. But as she spoke, the constable's eyes were drawn past her to the yard. There it was, the great black pot, suspended over a smoldering fire pit. A thick grayish scum coated the surface of the liquid within, and the air around it shimmered with a heat that was almost visible. The sickeningly sweet odor was overpowering here, a smell of boiled fat and something else, something metallic and vaguely familiar, like a butcher's shop left to spoil in the sun. Manville gestured towards the cauldron. "That's a powerful smell, Mrs. Utterback. You must be making a great deal of soap." Elizabeth's eyes flickered for just a moment. "It is a long and messy process, Constable," she replied, her voice still unnervingly level. "One must boil the lard and lye for many days." But the constable knew the process soap making. He knew its smells and its textures. And this macabre stew bubbling under the Virginia sky was no soap. He felt a knot of pure dread tighten in his gut. He had come here expecting a domestic dispute, a runaway husband. He was beginning to understand. He had stumbled into a nightmare. To comprehend the darkness that had bloomed on the Utterback farm, one must first understand the world from which it sprang. Fauquier County, Virginia, in the 1840s, was a place caught between the genteel traditions of the Old South and the rugged uncertainty of the frontier. It was a land of rolling hills and dense forests, of isolated farms connected by little more than dirt tracks and shared faith. Life was governed by the seasons, by the word of the Bible, and by a strict social order where a man's reputation was his most valuable currency. John Utterback was a man who fit this world perfectly. He was in his late 40s, a respectable, hardworking farmer known for his stern demeanor and his unwavering piety. He was not a man given to whims or sudden departures. His farm was his kingdom, his work was his purpose. His life was etched into the very soil he tilled, a predictable pattern of planting and harvesting, of prayer and perseverance. He was, by all accounts, a permanent fixture in the community, as solid and unmovable as the ancient oaks that dotted his property. His marriage to Elizabeth, a woman some 15 years his junior, had been seen as a sensible match. She was quiet, industrious, and from a family of modest but decent standing. To the outside world, they were a portrait of rural respectability. Their small log cabin, though humble, was always tidy, their livestock healthy, and their presence at Sunday service unwavering. They were part of the bedrock of the community, a family whose life seemed to promise nothing more dramatic than the changing of the seasons. But beneath this veneer of pastoral calm, secrets can fester. In the crushing isolation of a remote farm, in the silent spaces between a husband and a wife, a different reality can take hold, one that is unseen and unheard by the outside world, until it erupts with horrifying violence. The story of John Utterback's disappearance began, as many such stories do, with a quiet and unsettling absence. One Sunday, his usual place in the church pew was empty. When neighbors inquired, Elizabeth told them her husband had been called away on urgent business, a matter concerning a distant cousin's inheritance. It was a plausible enough explanation, and in a time when communication was slow and unreliable, it was accepted. A week passed, then two. John Utterback did not return. The questions began again, more pointed this time. Elizabeth's story changed. The business with the cousin she now claimed had been a pretext. The truth, she confided in a hushed tone to a neighboring wife, was that John had been struck with the fever for the West. He had spoken of it for months, she said, a yearning for the vast, untamed lands of Missouri or beyond. He felt constrained by his life in Virginia, and one night he had simply decided to leave, packing his few valuable possessions and slipping away before dawn. She painted a picture of a restless, dissatisfied man, a man whose ambitions had outgrown his small farm. This new version of events was far more shocking, but it played on a familiar narrative of the era. Men did, on occasion, abandon their families, chasing the siren song of the frontier. It was a dereliction of duty, a scandal, but it was not unheard of. It cast John in a new, unflattering light, and it positioned Elizabeth as a pitiable, abandoned wife. For a time, this story held. It created a space of sympathy around her, deflecting the community's questions with a narrative of betrayal. But the story, like the woman who told it, had a fundamental flaw. It did not account for the man they knew. The John Utterback of their experience was not a dreamer. He was a man of roots, a man whose identity was inseparable from his land. The idea of him abandoning it all on a whim felt profoundly, disturbingly wrong. As the summer weeks bled into one another, the image of Elizabeth Utterback as the wronged, abandoned wife began to fray at the edges. Her behavior was not that of a woman pining for a lost husband. There was no visible grief, no period of distraught waiting by the window. Instead, a strange, manic energy seemed to possess her. She was seen at market, not haggling for household necessities, but inquiring about the price of livestock. Within a month of John's supposed departure, she had sold his favorite plow horse. Then, his two best oxen were sold to a farmer miles away. She began selling his tools, his harnesses, the very instruments of the life he had supposedly left behind. Each transaction was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of his memory, and her neighbors watched with growing unease. The haste was what unsettled them most. It felt less like a woman liquidating assets out of necessity, and more like a person systematically erasing a man's existence. A concerned deacon from their church paid her a visit, offering condolences and support. He found her not in mourning but scrubbing the cabin's wooden floorboards with a fierce, almost violent intensity. She explained that with John gone, she had to be practical, that she couldn't manage the farm alone. She spoke of her husband in the past tense, not as a man who might one day return, but as a chapter that was definitively closed. The deacon left the farm with a deep sense of disquiet. He had come to comfort a victim, but he felt as though he had met a conspirator. The whispers started to change then, evolving from gossip into suspicion. The question was no longer where did John Utterback go, but a far more sinister one. What did Elizabeth do to him? The human mind abhors a vacuum, and in the absence of John Utterback, the community of Fauquier County filled the void with speculation and rumor. The seeds of doubt, planted by Elizabeth's strange behavior, grew into thick vines of dark conjecture. Old stories were resurrected. Casual remarks once forgotten were now re-examined as potential clues. People recalled that John Utterback, for all his piety, had a formidable temper. Had he and Elizabeth fought? More than one neighbor remembered hearing raised voices coming from the Utterback cabin on the night he supposedly vanished. One woman, whose property bordered theirs, now SW. Or she had heard a single, sharp cry cut through the stillness of the night, a sound she had dismissed at the time as a fox or a panther. Now, her imagination recast it as something human, something final. Others spoke of Elizabeth's character. She had always been quiet, yes, but some now reinterpreted that quietness as a cold, watchful stillness. They said she had hard eyes, the kind that didn't flinch. Rumors of a forbidden affair began to circulate, a whispered suggestion that perhaps Elizabeth had found a reason to want her older husband gone. No name was ever attached to this phantom lover, but the insinuation alone was enough to paint her as a woman capable of monstrous deception. These were dangerous accusations, the kind that could ruin a person even if untrue. But they were fueled by a growing, collective intuition that the official story was a lie. This was no simple case of a man abandoning his home. It was a cold case in the making, a vanishing act that felt less like a departure and more like an erasure. The community, acting as a single, suspicious organism, was slowly turning against the widow. They watched her, they talked about her, and they waited, certain that the truth, whatever it was buried somewhere on that isolated farm. If you find these dark chapters of history as compelling as we do, and wish to see more forbidden tales brought into the light, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is a journey into the shadows of the past, and what follows in the case of Elizabeth Utterback is a descent into a darkness few can imagine. The rumors and suspicions swirling around the widow were about to coalesce around a single, horrifying piece of sensory evidence: the smell. It began faintly at first, a strange note in the air that was difficult to place. But as the August heat intensified, so did the odor. It was a complex, layered scent, both sweet and rancid, with an undercurrent of something acrid like scorched metal. It did not smell like anything natural. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal in the woods, which was common enough. This was different. It was a thick, greasy, man-made stench that seemed to coat the back of the throat. Those who lived closest to the Utterback property found it unbearable. It seeped into their homes, tainted their meals, and haunted their sleep. When questioned, Elizabeth had a ready answer. She was engaged in the arduous, foul-smelling task of soap making. It was a chore most farm wives undertook, boiling animal fat, lard, and tallow, with lye derived from wood ash to produce a harsh, effective soap for the coming year. The process was notoriously unpleasant. But even the most experienced farmers and their wives, who were intimately familiar with the smells of the land and its processes, knew that this was not the smell of soap. It was something more macabre, something infinitely more disturbing. The smell became the focal point of all their fears, a constant, unavoidable reminder that the official story of John Utterback's departure was a fabrication, and the truth was something putrid, something that was actively decomposing just over the next hill. For John Utterback's family, the combination of Elizabeth's suspicious actions and the horrifying smell was too much to bear. His younger brother, William, who lived in a neighboring county, had never believed the story of his brother's flight to the west. John was not impulsive. He was a man of deep attachments to his land and his kin. William had made the journey to Fauquier County several times, pleading with Elizabeth for more information, for a letter, for any proof of life. Each time, he was met with a cold indifference that chilled him to the bone. Now, hearing the rumors from the neighbors, hearing the disturbing accounts of the cauldron and the vile stench, William's anxiety turned to cold certainty. He knew in his heart that his brother had met with foul play, and that his sister-in-law was at the center of it. He rode directly to the county seat and demanded to speak with the magistrate. He laid out the entire disturbing timeline: the sudden disappearance, the changing stories, the shockingly fast sale of his brother's most prized possessions, and now, the final, macabre detail of the constant fire and the unbearable odor that Elizabeth claimed was just soap. He painted a picture not of an abandoned wife, but of a calculating killer methodically erasing all evidence of her crime. The magistrate, a prudent man not given to acting on country gossip, could no longer ignore the sheer weight of the circumstantial evidence. The story was too strange, the details too specific, the character of John Utterback too at odds with his wife's claims. A formal inquiry was necessary. He summoned Constable Manville, a man known for his steady nerve, and gave him the order: "Go to the Utterback farm, question the widow, and do not leave until you are satisfied." It was with this official sanction that Manville set out on that fateful afternoon, riding toward a truth more grotesque than any of the rumors had dared to suggest. When Constable Manville stepped inside the Utterback cabin, the first thing that struck him was its almost preternatural cleanliness. In an era when homes were constantly battling dust from the roads and soot from the fireplace, the single room was immaculate. The floorboards, which he'd seen Elizabeth scrubbing weeks earlier, were scoured nearly white. There was no clutter, no sign of the daily life of a busy farm. It felt less like a home and more like a space that had been deliberately and systematically cleansed. The air inside was thick with the scent of lye, but underneath it, the same sweet, sickening odor from the yard persisted, clinging to the wooden walls and the simple furniture. Manville began his questioning again, his tone now stripped of all pleasantry. He was no longer a concerned neighbor. He was an agent of the law. He asked Elizabeth to recount in precise detail the last day she saw her husband. He asked for the exact date, the time of day, what John had been wearing, what he had packed. As he pressed her, her composure, so unnervingly solid before, began to crack. Her narrative, which had seemed plausible enough when told in bits and pieces, began to unravel under direct, methodical scrutiny. The dates shifted. The details contradicted each other. She claimed he took his horse, but the constable had already ascertained from neighbors that the horse had been sold by her 2 weeks after John vanished. She said he took a good sum of money with him, yet the family knew John kept his savings locked in a chest that now sat empty in the corner of the room. With every question, the web of lies grew more tangled, and Elizabeth became more agitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The immaculate cabin began to feel like a trap, and she, its cornered, desperate architect. The constable's gaze swept the room, searching for any inconsistency, any detail out of place. His eyes landed on the large stone hearth, the heart of any cabin home. It was swept clean, but a section of the stone at the base looked different. It was darker, as if stained by something that had seeped deep into the porous surface. He walked over and ran his hand over it. A faint, greasy residue came away on his fingertips. When he asked Elizabeth about it, she claimed a pot of lard had overturned while she was rendering it, a common enough accident. But the explanation felt thin, another hastily constructed patch on a story full of holes. His attention then turned to the floorboards near the hearth. Despite the vigorous scrubbing, he could see faint, dark lines in the gaps between the planks, as if a large quantity of liquid had been spilled and had seeped down into the subfloor. He knelt, pressing his nose closer. The metallic undertone of the ever-present smell was stronger here. It was the smell of old blood, a scent that, once known, is never forgotten. He stood up and looked at Elizabeth. The color had drained from her face. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. He knew he was standing in the exact spot where the violence had occurred. He didn't know the how or the why, but the what was beginning to scream at him from the very stones and wood of the cabin. John Utterback had not ridden off to the west. His journey had ended right here, on this very floor, in a moment of brutal, final violence. The clean cabin was not a sign of a diligent housewife. It was the sanitized stage of a horrific crime. And the architect of that crime was standing just a few feet away, her mask of composure finally crumbling into dust. Leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the cabin, Constable Manville walked back into the yard, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. He circled the large iron cauldron, the source of the foul stench that had alerted the entire county. The fire beneath it had died down to glowing embers, but the contents of the pot still radiated a palpable heat. He peered over the edge. The substance inside was a thick, semi-solid slurry, the color of dirty dishwater with a layer of congealed, greasy yellow fat on top. It looked like a monstrous failed batch of something, but what? He poked at the surface with a long stick. The stick met resistance, not the uniform consistency of soap in its early stages, but something lumpy, something hard. He scraped away some of the greasy scum. What he saw beneath the surface made the breath catch in his throat. Floating in the grotesque liquid were small, whitish objects. At first they were unidentifiable, but then he saw one that was unmistakable in its shape and size. It was a piece of bone, a fragment of a human rib. He fished it out with the stick. His blood ran cold. He stirred the pot again, this time with a grim purpose. More fram. Ents emerged from the murky depths. A piece of what looked like a knuckle, a larger curved shard that could only have come from a skull. And then the most damning object of all, a human tooth, its root still intact, blackened by the heat and the chemical action of the lye. There could be no more doubt. Elizabeth Utterback was not making soap. She was rendering a human body. She was boiling her husband, dissolving his flesh from his bones in a macabre effort to erase him from the face of the earth. The constable turned from the pot, his face a mask of grim resolve. He looked at Elizabeth, who had followed him out and was now standing by the cabin door, her expression frozen in a strange mixture of terror and resignation. The game was over. He held up the stick, the small piece of bone clinging to the end. He didn't need to say a word. The sight of it, this undeniable proof of her crime, shattered the last of her defenses. A sound escaped her lips, a low, guttural wail that was part grief, part fury, part despair. The dam of her composure broke and the confession came flooding out, a torrent of words tumbling over each other in a chaotic, desperate rush. She admitted it all. John was not in Missouri. He was in the pot, and in the freshly turned soil of the vegetable garden, and buried beneath the new flagstones of the hearth. She began to speak of their life together, not the placid, pious image the community saw, but a hidden, private hell. She spoke of John's coldness, his cruelty, his violent temper that would erupt without warning behind the closed doors of their isolated cabin. She described a life of fear and subjugation, of being treated as little more than property. She claimed that on that fateful night he had come home in a drunken rage, threatening to beat her, threatening to end her life. It was then, she said, in a moment of pure animal terror that she had fought back. She had seized a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and she had struck him. She described the awful, sickening crunch of the blow, the way he had crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide with a final, shocked surprise. He was dead, and her new, horrifying problem had just begun. The murder itself, as Elizabeth described it, was a frantic, desperate act of self-preservation. But what followed was a testament to a mind of chilling, methodical clarity. Immediate math, husband's body lying on the floor of their small cabin, she was not paralyzed by panic. Instead, a cold, pragmatic dread took hold. She was alone, miles from any neighbor, with a dead body and a crime that would surely lead her to the gallows. Her mind, she said, worked with a speed and focus she had never known. She couldn't bury him whole, the grave would be too large, too obvious. She couldn't sink him in the creek, the body would eventually rise. She had to make him vanish. And then her eyes fell upon the massive iron cauldron in the yard, the one used for scalding hogs at butchering time and for making soap. An idea, born of pure desperation and macabre ingenuity, began to form in her mind. She knew the power of lye. She knew how it could break down fat and tissue. She had seen what it did to animal hides. What if, she reasoned, it could do the same to a man? What if she could unmake her husband, piece by piece, boiling his flesh away until nothing was left but easily disposable fragments of bone? It was a plan of such monstrousness that it defied all convention, all morality. It was a descent into a kind of practical domestic horror, using the very tools of her household life, the soap pot, the butchering knives, the fire, to commit an act of almost unimaginable creation. Decision was made. In the dead of night, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon, Elizabeth Utterback began the grim and forbidden task of dismembering her husband's corpse. This next part of the story is particularly disturbing. It details the methodical process of destroying a human body, and it may not be suitable for all viewers. If you've been captivated by this dark history so far, your subscription helps us continue to explore these challenging and often banned narratives from the past. Elizabeth's confession, as recorded by the stunned constable, spared no gruesome detail. She described how she dragged John's body from the cabin to the large oak stump she used as a butchering block. Using the same axe he used to chop firewood and the same knives she used to dress chickens, she began her terrible work. She recounted the process with a detached, clinical horror, as if speaking of another person. She explained the grim anatomy of her task, the difficulty of separating limb from torso, the sheer physical strength it required. She worked through the night, a solitary, blood-spattered figure toiling under the uncaring stars. She said she did not feel madness or revulsion, only a single-minded focus on the task at hand. Every piece of her husband had Obi reduced to a manageable size, small enough to fit into the great iron pot. By dawn, the deed was done. The cabin floor was soaked with blood, and the dismembered remains of John Utterback lay in a grim pile beside the fire pit. She spent the next day engaged in a frenzy of cleaning, scrubbing the floors with lye and sand until her hands were raw, trying to erase the physical evidence of the slaughter that had taken place. But the stains had seeped deep into the wood, a permanent testament to her crime, a ghost of evidence that the constable would discover weeks later. While the cabin was being cleansed, the fire was lit under the cauldron, and the next, even more horrifying man filled her from the well and added scoop after scoop of caustic lye, the same chemical she used to make soap. Then, piece by piece, she added the remains of her husband to the pot. The water began to heat, and a foul-smelling steam, the genesis of the odor that would eventually betray her, began to rise into the air. For days she tended the fire, a lonely, grim vigil over the bubbling, macabre stew. She described the horrifying transformation that took place within the pot. The lye and the intense heat worked their terrible magic, breaking down the soft tissues, dissolving the skin, the muscle, the organs, rendering them into a thick, gelatinous sludge. She had to stir the contents constantly with a long wooden paddle to keep them from sticking and scorching, a grotesque parody of a housewife stirring a pot of soup. At night, she would sleep fitfully, the sound of the bubbling cauldron just outside her window a constant, gurgling reminder of her deed. By day, she would put on a mask of normalcy, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, and offering a calm wave to any neighbor who might pass by on the road, all while the evidence of her crime simmered away just a few yards from where she stood. She became a prisoner of her own horrifying process, bound to the fire, bound to the pot, until its grisly work was done. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply personal act of destruction. She was not just hiding a body. She was systematically unmaking the man who had been her husband, boiling away his very identity until all that was left was a foul-smelling liquid and a handful of brittle, anonymous bones. After days of constant boiling, the process was nearly complete. The once human contents of the pot had been reduced to the thick, slurry-like substance the constable would later discover. All that remained of John Utterback were the most resilient parts of his anatomy, his bones and his teeth. Elizabeth strained the contents of the pot through a coarse sieve, separating the liquid from the solids. The gruesome, semi-liquid remains she poured into a deep pit she had dug in her garden, covering it with soil and planting new vegetables over the top, a macabre form of fertilizer. This, she hoped, would fully account for the foul smell, and any lingering odor could be blamed on the spoiled soap she had buried. The bones were a different problem. They were the most undeniable evidence of her crime. She gathered them up, blackened and brittle from the boiling process. Some of the smaller fragments she crushed into powder with a heavy mallet, scattering the dust to the winds. The larger, more recognizable pieces she knew she had to hide more carefully. Under the cover of darkness, she pried up several of the large, flat stones that made up the hearth inside her cabin. In the shallow space beneath, she buried the last remaining fragments of her husband, a piece of his skull, a section of his jawbone, and a few vertebrae. She replaced the stones, carefully sealing them with fresh mortar. Her husband was now a part of the house itself, his final resting place just inches from where she would sit to warm herself by the fire. With the last bone hidden, she believed she had committed the perfect crime. She had erased a man from the world, leaving, she thought, not a single trace behind. But she had overlooked one crucial element, the indelible memory of scent and the unyielding suspicion of her neighbors. The confession, delivered in a flood of exhaustion and despair, left Constable Manville and the small group of men who had accompanied him in stunned silence. They were hardened country folk, familiar with death and hardship, but the tale they had just heard was something beyond their comprehension. It was a story of such cold, calculated brutality, mixed with a chilling domestic familiarity, that it seemed to belong to the realm of nightmares, not the waking world of Fauquier County. The constable placed Elizabeth Utterback under arrest. There was no resistance. The fight had gone out of her, leaving behind an empty, hollowed-out shell of a woman. As she was led away from the farm, she did not look back. She left behind the cabin, the garden, and the still warm cauldron that had served as her age. Husband's tomb and her undoing. Word of the arrest and the horrifying discovery spread through the county like a fever. The Utterback farm became a place of morbid pilgrimage. People came from miles around to stare at the cabin, to whisper by the fire pit, to gaze upon the iron pot that had been the instrument of such a macabre crime. They were drawn by a mixture of horror and fascination, a need to see with their own eyes the scene of an act that defied belief. The story of the boiling widow of Virginia was born, a piece of instant, horrifying folklore. The details, embellished with every telling, became the stuff of local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to frightened children for generations to come. The farm itself was now seen as a cursed place, tainted by the terrible secret it had held for so long. The sweet, sickening smell was gone, but the memory of it, and the knowledge of what it signified, would linger in the collective consciousness of the community forever. The trial of Elizabeth Utterback was a sensation. The small Fauquier County courthouse was packed to overflowing every day. Journalists from as far away as Richmond and Baltimore attended, eager to send dispatches about the sensational case of the woman who had boiled her husband. The prosecution, led by the county's most esteemed lawyer, laid out the damning evidence. The testimony of the neighbors about her strange behavior and the horrifying smell. Constable Mandeville's account of the discovery of the bone fragments and the tooth in the cauldron. And most importantly, Elizabeth's own detailed confession, which she had signed in the presence of the magistrate. The defense, a young, court-appointed attorney, was faced with an impossible task. He did not deny the act itself. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, he attempted to build a case based on years of horrific abuse. He argued that Elizabeth was not a cold-blooded monster, but a terrified victim who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. He brought witnesses who testified, albeit reluctantly, to John Utterback's known temper and his history of heavy drinking. He tried to paint a picture of a desperate woman trapped in a violent marriage, with no legal or social recourse. He argued that the murder was not a premeditated act of malice, but a tragic final act of self-defense. And the gruesome aftermath, the boiling of the body, he portrayed as the panicked, irrational actions of a traumatized mind, not the cold calculations of a cunning killer. The question for the jury was no longer about what she had done, but why. Was she a wicked, conniving witch who had murdered her husband to gain her freedom? Or was she a broken woman who had committed an unspeakable act to save her own life? The jury, composed entirely of male landowners and farmers from the county, listened intently to both sides. They were men of their time, steeped in a patriarchal culture that viewed a wife's obedience to her husband as a sacred duty. The concept of a woman killing her husband, regardless of the circumstances, was an almost unthinkable violation of the natural order. The prosecution played on these deep-seated beliefs. They portrayed Elizabeth as an unnatural woman, a fiend in female form, who had usurped the authority of her husband with monstrous violence. They argued that her claims of abuse were a convenient and self-serving lie, a desperate attempt to excuse an inexcusable crime. They pointed to the methodical and gruesome destruction of the body as proof of her cold, unfeeling nature. What kind of woman, they asked, could dismember and boil the body of her own husband? Surely only a monster devoid of all human compassion. The descriptions of the act itself, repeated in court, sent waves of revulsion through the gallery. The very idea of boiling a human being like an animal was so profoundly shocking, so deeply taboo, that it overshadowed any mitigating claims of abuse. The act was so monstrous that it seemed to demand a monstrous perpetrator. Elizabeth sat through the proceedings like a statue, her face an impassive mask. She showed no emotion as the horrifying details of her crime were laid bare for the public to dissect. Her stoicism was interpreted by many not as a sign of shock or trauma, but as further proof of her cold, remorseless heart. In the court of public opinion, and very likely in the jury room, her fate was already sealed, not just by the murder itself, but by the profoundly macabre nature of its cover-up. After a trial that lasted several days, the jury retired to deliberate. They did not take long. The evidence, particularly the confession and the physical remains, was undeniable. The claims of abuse, while possibly true, were not seen as a legal justification for murder in 1845. They returned to the courtroom with a verdict: guilty. Elizabeth Utterback was convicted of the murder of her husband, John. The judge, in his sentencing, spoke of the unprecedented barbarity of the crime, calling it an affront to God and to the community. He sentenced her to the harshest penalty the law allowed. The exact details of her fate are somewhat obscured by the passage of time and the nature of record-keeping in the era. In some accounts, she was sentenced to hang, the traditional punishment for such a heinous crime. The image of the boiling widow meeting her end at the gallows would have served as a powerful and terrifying lesson for the community. Other accounts suggest a different, perhaps more merciful fate. Given her claims of abuse and the potential for the jury to have recommended leniency, it is possible she was sentenced to life imprisonment in the newly established Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond. This would have been a living death, a sentence to be served out in the grim, brutal conditions of a 19th-century prison. There is also a third, more ambiguous possibility mentioned in some local folklore, that she was declared criminally insane, her macabre actions seen as proof of a mind utterly detached from reality, and was confined to an asylum for the rest of her days. Whichever sentence was carried out, Elizabeth Utterback effectively vanished from the world, her name and her horrifying crime passing from news into legend. The legacy of the Utterback murder haunted Fauquier County for decades. The farm itself was abandoned, falling into ruin. No family was willing to live on the land where such a horror had occurred. The cabin slowly rotted, the fields became overgrown with weeds, and the great iron cauldron, the centerpiece of the crime, was supposedly left where it stood, a rusting monument to the dark events of 1845. For generations, it was a place local children would dare each other to approach, a place where people claimed to see strange lights or hear disembodied sounds on moonless nights. The story became a staple of local folklore, a dark tale told around winter fires. With each telling, Elizabeth became less of a real person and more of a mythological figure, a boogeyman, the soap-making witch of the Hollow. The details of her alleged abuse at the hands of John were largely forgotten, erased from the popular narrative. What remained was the pure, visceral horror of her act, the image of a woman stirring a pot containing the dissolving remains of her husband. She became a simple symbol of ultimate female transgression, a monster who had violated the most sacred bonds of marriage and Christian decency. The macabre nature of her crime was so potent that it eclipsed any nuance, any possibility of her being a victim herself. The boiling of the body was an act so far beyond the pale of normal human behavior that it defined her entirely, reducing a complex and tragic story of domestic violence into a simple, horrifying campfire tale. The truth of what happened in that cabin, the fear, the desperation, the rage, was lost, buried under the weight of the legend she herself had created. Looking back at the case from a modern perspective, the story of Elizabeth Utterback becomes even more complex and troubling. We are left with a series of deeply unsettling, unanswered questions. Chief among them is the true nature of her relationship with John. Was he the pious, hard-working farmer the community knew, or was he the violent, abusive tyrant that Elizabeth described in her confession? In an era where domestic abuse was a private matter, hidden behind closed doors and rarely, if ever, prosecuted, it is entirely plausible that she was telling the truth. For a woman in her position, there was no escape. The law, the church, and society all offered her no protection and no way out of a violent marriage. If her claims were true, was the murder an act of cold-blooded malice, or the final, tragic outcome of what we would today call battered woman syndrome? Did she snap after years of abuse, striking out in a moment of terror, as she claimed? Or did she carefully plan the murder of her husband to free herself from his control? Her actions after the murder suggest a mind capable of both panic and cold, methodical planning. The dismemberment and boiling of the body is so extreme, so far outside the bounds of a typical response, that it raises further questions about her psychological state. Was this the calculated work of a sociopath, or the desperate, irrational act of a mind fractured by trauma? We can never truly know the answers. The historical record is too thin, filtered through the biases of a 19th-century legal system and a sensationalist press. All we are left with is the horrifying act itself, and the two competing narratives that attempt to explain it. The method Elizabeth chose to dispose of the body is perhaps the most enduring and disturbing aspect of the entire case. Boiling a human body in a cauldron is not something that would occur to most people, even in the most desperate of circumstances. It speaks to a unique and horrifying intersection of domestic knowledge and criminal ingenuity. As a 19th-century farm wife, Elizabeth would have been intimately familiar with the processes of life and death. She would have known how to butcher animals, how to render fat into lard, and how to use lye to make soap. These were common, everyday skills. Her macabre brilliance was in applying this domestic, life-sustaining knowledge to a life-ending, criminal purpose. She took the tools of her trade, the cauldron for scalding hogs, the lye for cleaning, the knives for butchering, and repurposed them for the complete eradication of a human being. There is a deeply unsettling intimacy to the act. It wasn't a quick burial in a shallow grave. It was a prolonged, multi-day process that required her constant attention. She had to tend the fire, stir the contents, and live with the horrifying sights and smells of her husband's dissolution. This suggests a psychological state of profound detachment, an ability to compartmentalize her actions, and treat the human body as nothing more than raw material to be processed and disposed of. It is this grotesque fusion of the mundane and the monstrous, the transformation of a simple farm chore into an act of almost satanic desecration, that makes her crime so uniquely horrifying and ensures its place in the annals of macabre history. The Utterback case stands as a chilling example of what can happen in conditions of extreme isolation. The farm was remote, the nearest neighbors a significant distance away. In such a setting, a home can become a private kingdom, ruled by its own secret laws and dynamics, completely invisible to the outside world. For John Utterback, this isolation may have provided the freedom to be the tyrant his wife described, with no one to witness or intervene. For Elizabeth, this same isolation meant there was no one to turn to for help, no one to hear her cries, no escape from her alleged tormentor. After the murder, this isolation became both her curse and her opportunity. It gave her the time and the privacy to carry out her gruesome plan without immediate discovery. For weeks, she was able to tend her horrifying cauldron, shielded from prying eyes by the dense Virginia woods. But this isolation also amplified her every action. In a tightly knit rural community, any deviation from the norm was noticed. Her husband's absence, her strange behavior, and ultimately the smell were magnified by the quiet, watchful nature of country life. The very isolation that may have enabled the crime also ensured that its cover-up would eventually fail. The community, though physically distant, was socially close. The web of gossip and suspicion acted as a slow-moving, but ultimately effective, alarm system. The case demonstrates a fundamental paradox, that in the most isolated of places, you are never truly alone, and the secrets you try to bury have a way of seeping out, carried on the air itself for all to sense. The story of Elizabeth Utterback also serves as a stark reminder of the brutal realities of the 19th century justice system, especially for women. When Elizabeth stood trial, she was judged by a system created entirely by and for men. The jury, the judge, the lawyers, the constable, all were men. The concept of a woman's testimony of abuse being a valid defense for killing her husband was virtually non-existent. The law viewed her not as a citizen with rights, but as the property of her husband. Her duty was to obey and endure. By killing him, she had not just committed murder, she had committed a form of insurrection against the established social order. The horror expressed at her trial was not just about the act of killing, but about a woman taking ultimate power over a man. Her claims of self-defense were likely viewed as a convenient fiction, a woman's manipulative attempt to escape justice. We can only imagine the terror and hopelessness she must have felt, standing before a court that was culturally and legally incapable of understanding, let alone sympathizing with, her position. Whether she was a monster or a victim, or some tragic combination of both, she was guaranteed to be condemned. The system had no other category for a woman like her. The trial was less an impartial search for truth, and more a societal ritual designed to punish a profound transgression and restore the proper order of things. Her conviction was a foregone conclusion, a reassertion of a world where men held power, and women who violently defied it were to be excised from society, either by the rope or by the prison wall. We must also consider the role that folklore and storytelling played in shaping the memory of this event. The moment Elizabeth's crime was discovered, it ceased to be a simple legal case and was transformed into a legend. The press of the day, with its appetite for sensationalism, undoubtedly played a role, printing lurid headlines that likely stripped the story of any nuance. But the most powerful force was word of mouth. In the rural communities of 19th century America, storytelling was a primary form of entertainment and information dissemination. A tale as shocking and macabre as this one was potent material. It had all the elements of a classic Gothic horror story: an isolated farmhouse, a mysterious disappearance, a sinister widow, and a ghastly, unspeakable secret. As the story was told and retold, it would have been polished and shaped, the horrifying details emphasized, the sympathetic elements stripped away. Elizabeth the desperate, possibly abused wife became Elizabeth the boiling widow, a creature of pure, almost supernatural evil. This transformation is a common process in folklore. We simplify complex, morally ambiguous events into clear-cut narratives of good versus evil because they are easier to tell and more satisfying to hear. The legend of the boiling widow served a social purpose. It was a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind a neighbor's door, a warning about the monstrous potential of a woman who steps outside her prescribed role. But in becoming a legend, the real Elizabeth Utterback, a human being caught in a web of violence and desperation, was lost forever, replaced by the one-dimensional monster of the story. The final, chilling piece of the puzzle is Elizabeth's psychological state during the commission of her crime. The act of murdering her husband in a fit of rage or fear is, while horrific, psychologically understandable. It is the events that followed that push the story into the realm of the truly disturbing. To conceive of, and then execute the plan of boiling the body required a mind capable of an extraordinary level of dissociation. She had to be able to look at the remains of the man she had married, the man who was the father of her children, if they had any, a detail often lost, and see not a person, but a problem to be solved, a piece of matter to be disposed of. This suggests a profound psychological break, a complete severing of emotional connection. Was this the result of long-term trauma, a mind so brutalized by abuse that it had shut down all normal human feeling? Or does it point to an underlying pathology, a pre-existing lack of empathy that made such a cold, utilitarian act possible? We see this kind of methodical, emotionless disposal of a body in the crimes of modern serial killers, individuals who view their victims as objects. To find such a chillingly modern psychological profile in a case from 1845 is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the darkest and most forbidden potentials of the human mind are timeless. Elizabeth's actions force us to confront a horrifying possibility, that the person we share our home with, the person we know most intimately, could, under the right pressure, become a stranger, a creature of cold, pragmatic monstrosity, capable of acts that defy our understanding of what it means to be human. If you are the kind of person who is drawn to the shadows, who seeks to understand the darkest corners of human history, then we invite you to join our community by subscribing. We believe that by examining these forbidden stories, we learn something profound about ourselves. The case of Elizabeth Utterback is a powerful example of how a single act can ripple through time, leaving a permanent stain on a place and its people. For years after the trial, the abandoned Utterback farm was a source of morbid fascination. Artifacts from the crime scene became sought-after relics. The cauldron, in particular, took on a life of its own. According to some local legends, it was eventually removed and passed through several hands before disappearing from history, while other stories claim it was left to rust in the woods, a silent, ominous presence. The hearthstones under which the final bone fragments were buried were torn up, either by law enforcement or by morbid souvenir hunters. The cabin itself was eventually consumed by the elements or torn down, its blood-soaked timbers returning to the earth. But the erasure of the physical site could not erase the memory of the crime. The story attached itself to the land, creating what paranormal enthusiasts might call a psychic scar. It became one of those local places that people instinctively avoid after dark, a place where the weight of a past tragedy feels palpable in the air. This is the power of a truly macabre event. It transcends its own time, becoming a permanent part of a region's psychological landscape, a dark landmark on its historical map. The Utterback farm ceased to be just a piece of property. It became a destination in a geography of horror. One of the most compelling aspects of dark historical cases like this is to compare them with the present day. How would the case of Elizabeth Utterback be handled if it happened today? The discovery of the crime would likely be much faster. Modern forensic science would have been able to identify the remains in the pot almost instantly through DNA analysis. The blood evidence in the cabin, invisible to the naked eye after her scrubbing, would have been easily detected with luminol, painting a clear picture of the location and brutality of the murder. But the most significant difference would be in the courtroom. Elizabeth's claims of long-term abuse would be taken far more seriously. A modern defense team would build a powerful case around battered woman syndrome, using expert psychological testimony to explain how a history of trauma could lead to such a violent and seemingly bizarre post-mortem act. The media coverage would be relentless, a 24-hour news cycle debating her guilt and her victimhood. She would become a cause célèbre for some and a figure of revulsion for others. The outcome of the trial would be far from certain. A modern jury, with a greater understanding of the psychology of abuse, might well return a verdict of manslaughter instead of first not by of insanity. It is a change settled on. The widow, figure of Hermanhood in the 9th century, species a trick and aesthetic in the first. This show how much understanding of justice, color, and violence has changed, and it forces us to how their monster history were in victim world known for their ring. Utterback's forced to the dark that can within the ordered set, harm, a measure. These are supposed to be symbols of safety, stability, and nourishment. Elizabeth's crime was a horrifying perversion of all three. She turned her home into a slaughterhouse. She turned the bond of marriage into a motive for murder. And most disturbingly, she turned the tools of nourishment and cleanliness, the cauldron for rendering lard, the lye for making soap, into instruments of desecration. This inversion of the domestic sphere is what makes the crime so deeply unsettling. The horror did not come from outside, from a monster in the woods or a marauding stranger. It came from within the heart of the family, from the hands of the person who was supposed to be the caregiver, the nurturer. Used her stick as a cover crime, making plausible every skew horror smells her owing. The very way the thing that our homes are saving, ruling that just easily prison, slabberies for darkest and images. It reminds us that the profound horror often ones we can move, the quiet ones unfold behind those doors of an ordinary lookout. In an ordinary town, by an ordinary person as, for reasons we may never fully understand, decided to embrace the monster within. Let us consider the final moments of John Utterback's life. According to Elizabeth's confession, it was a moment of drunken domestic terror. An argument, a threat, a violent escalation that was likely a common occurrence in their home. But this time was different. This time, his intended victim fought back. In that split second, as Elizabeth raised the iron poker, the power dynamic of their entire marriage was shattered and irrevocably reversed. The fear and subjugation she claimed to have endured for years were focused into a single, decisive act of violence. Also that her own sealed as a kill hang Vic pity. Thoughts passed through his mind that shot stillness. Did he pride, frail, or in reckon that I had lost there was none? We will know. His story with him, Macabre. He is silent central in this Macabre and of time by the told him at death. The mon's wife tribe, a man's crew drove unspeakable act. Was he the of a cold and calculating wife who wanted him gone? His silence is, in many ways, the dark heart of this story. Without his voice, we are left to sift through the conflicting narratives, the whispers of neighbors, and the self-serving confession of his killer, forever unable to know the absolute truth of what transpired between a husband and wife in that isolated Virginia cabin. Ultimately, the story of Elizabeth Utterback is a story about erasure. John Utterback was erased from life by a blow to the head. He was then systematically erased from existence, his body dismembered and dissolved in a horrifying chemical bath. His bones were crushed to dust or buried beneath the hearth, his memory erased by his wife's lies about a journey to the West. But Elizabeth, in her attempt to erase her husband, ended up erasing herself. By committing an act so monstrous, she erased her own identity, her own humanity in the eyes of the world. She was no longer Elizabeth Utterback, the woman, the wife, the possible victim. She became the boiling widow, a two-dimensional figure in a horror story, a name synonymous with a forbidden macabre act. Her own story, her motivations, her suffering, all were erased by the sheer, shocking power of her crime. And finally, she was erased from society, sent to all that memory itself, to a cycle of active erasure until almost but a name, series of dark questions. Powerful reminders are so profound that they consume, including the people who, leaving only a behind. The physical location is likely lost and reclaimed by orbed into larger its exact coordinate, but the most dedicated. There is no monument to these terrible events. All that remains, a piece of DNA passions, and most unsettling. The cruel so tied to the smell of the boiling bone fragments, the residue on the hearth. All of that physical completely gone. The bones, all of the actors are long dead. Left is the narrative time, but it that still has the ability to horrify, question the thin vision that separates the world of Elizabeth Utterback. It reminds us that the surface of any community, imaginable dark numbers, combination of ispiration and sickening smell made the Virginia air 75 years. The chilling memory that lingers on, stain on the historical record. The question that hangs over this entire affair, the one that lingers long after the horrifying details have settled, is one of human nature. What is a person capable of when pushed to the absolute limit? Elizabeth Utterback's story, in its most charitable interpretation, is a terrifying case study in the breaking of the human spirit. If we are to believe her confession, she endured a life of quiet desperation and brutal abuse. In an era that offered her no escape, The pressure built and built until the vessel of her sanity or her self-control shattered, releasing something primal and monstrous. Her actions, seen through this lens, become a horrifying form of liberation, a violent and grotesque declaration of independence. But this interpretation is, in its own way, as disturbing as the alternative. It suggests that inside the most ordinary, subjugated person, there exists a capacity for acts of extreme, calculated horror. It raises the question, how many other people in similar situations throughout history have been pushed to that same breaking point? How many other quiet, desperate acts of violence have gone undiscovered, their secrets successfully buried in the earth or dissolved in the lie? The case of Elizabeth Utterback is famous only because she was caught. It forces us to wonder about the ones who were not, about the other, silent John Utterbacks whose disappearances were successfully explained away, their remains never found. The true horror of the story is not just what one woman did, but the chilling realization that she may not have been entirely unique.